In the autumn of 1944, German ordnance officers in occupied France recovered the bodies of several unexploded American 5-inch antiaircraft shells from fields near the Channel coast. The shells were obviously American and obviously meant for the Royal Air Force's V-1 Buzzbomb intercept gun belt across Kent, but they were behaving strangely. They were detonating in midair without a contact strike, several feet from the target. The British and American gunners using them were knocking down German cruise missiles at a rate the Germans could not understand. The unexploded examples, duds that had punched into soft earth without going off, went by courier to Berlin, and from there to the Reich's senior fuse engineers at the Heereswaffenamt. The engineers cut them open, drew schematics, photographed the contents, and reported after months of analysis that they could not reproduce the design at a scale the German war economy could field. The shell that had been knocking down their V-1s would remain a closed problem for the Reich until the end of the war. The shell was the American proximity fuse. The Navy called it the VT fuse variable time. The Army called it the radio fuse. The men who designed it called it the secret weapon. Behind the atomic bomb, it was the most secret American weapons program of the war, classified at a level higher than the Manhattan Project for most of its development, and concealed by a deception campaign that was itself one of the war's great quiet operations. The men who designed it had not been sure in 1940 that it could be made to work at all. By 1944, they had built 130 million of them. By 1945, the proximity fuse had become the difference between a gun that had to hit an aircraft to bring it down and a gun that only had to come within 30 feet. The physics was the easy part. A small radio transmitter in a sealed compartment in the nose of a high-explosive shell broadcasts continuous radio waves outward from the shell as it flies toward a target. The waves bounce off any object the shell approaches. The reflected energy, picked up by the same transmitter acting now as a receiver, generates a small current. When the current exceeds a threshold, meaning the shell is within roughly 30 feet of a metal object, a thyratron tube triggers the detonator. The shell explodes. The aircraft, the cruise missile, the kamikaze dies in the fragment cloud. The engineering was the hard part. The transmitter, the receiver, the thyratron, the batteries, and the safety arming switch had to fit inside the nose cone of a shell roughly the size of an unfilled wine bottle. They had to survive the launch acceleration of a naval gun, 20,000 times the force of gravity, applied over a few milliseconds without coming apart. They had to survive the spin of the shell once airborne, somewhere around 500 revolutions per second. They had to function in temperature ranges from Arctic to equatorial. They had to be storable for months at sea on the gallery deck of a ship before use. And they had to cost, in production, less than the cost of the shell itself, because the shell was an item the Navy bought by the 100,000, and a fuse that doubled the shell's cost was a fuse that would not be fielded. The work began in the British Admiralty's Research Division in 1939, was passed to the Carnegie Institution of Washington in 1940 under the joint Anglo-American Tizard mission, and was moved to the new Applied Physics Laboratory at Johns Hopkins University in 1942 under Merle Tuve. Tuve was a physicist from South Dakota who had done his doctoral work at Hopkins in the 1920s and had pioneered the use of pulsed radio to measure the height of the ionosphere. He had also worked on the early development of the linear accelerator and was one of the small group of American physicists who understood before the war the engineering challenges of getting small electronic devices to survive extreme acceleration. The Navy gave Tuve a budget, a staff of about 1,000 engineers and technicians, and a deadline. Section T, the Proximity Fuse Project, became one of the most important scientific projects of the war. The first batches of fuses produced at Section T were tested in 1942 against pilotless target aircraft over the Chesapeake Bay. They worked. The next problem was production. The Crossley Radio Corporation of Cincinnati, an American consumer radio company, retooled its consumer assembly lines to produce miniature vacuum tubes that could survive 20,000 G of launch acceleration. The Sylvania Electric Products Company in Pennsylvania did the same. Eastman Kodak made the precision optical components. By the autumn of 1942, the Navy had its first operational stocks. By the end of 1944, American factories were producing 40,000 proximity fuses a day. The first combat use came on January 5, 1943, in the Solomon Islands. The light cruiser USS Helena, on convoy escort duty near Guadalcanal, was attacked by Japanese dive bombers in mid-afternoon. Her after 5-inch 38 caliber gun mount loaded VT-fused shells and fired 3 salvos at the incoming dive bombers. The second salvo brought one of the bombers down. The shell had not hit the aircraft. It had detonated within 30 feet of the aircraft. The fragments did the rest. The Navy classified the success and ordered the Helena's after-action report not to mention the new fuse by name. The deception would hold for nearly 2 years. American gunners on every ship using VT-fused ammunition were told the shells were a new pattern of mechanical time fuse and were forbidden, under threat of court-martial, from saying otherwise. The deception had been imposed because of one specific fear. The Navy believed that if a VT-fused shell came down in friendly territory or in shallow water and was recovered intact by the enemy, the Japanese or the Germans could reverse engineer it and apply the principle to their own anti-aircraft defenses. The implication for American bomber crews would have been catastrophic. To prevent recovery of dud shells in enemy hands, the Navy had restricted VT fuses for the first 18 months of their use to ammunition fired by ships at sea, where the duds would sink in deep water and could not be recovered. They were not issued to Army ground forces until late 1944, and even then only after exhaustive review of where the rounds might end up. The first authorization for Army ground use was the V-1 Buzzbomb defense of England in the summer of 1944. The German V-1 cruise missile, a small unmanned jet-powered aircraft launched from coastal sites in occupied France, carrying a 1,000-pound warhead, aimed at London, had begun arriving in June 1944. 23,000 V-1s would be launched against England over the next 9 months. The intercept defense was a belt of anti-aircraft guns and Royal Air Force fighters along the Kent coast. Through June and early July of 1944, the gun belt's success rate against V-1s ran at about 25%, 3 out of 4 cruise missiles reaching London or its suburbs. On July 27, 1944, the Allies began issuing VT-fused ammunition to the V-1 gun belt. The success rate climbed in days. By the 3rd week of August, it had reached 79%. By the 2nd week of September, the gun belt was destroying more V-1s than were getting through. The German campaign collapsed before the launch sites in occupied France were overrun. The London casualty figures that had been expected for that period of the war never appeared. The recovered unexploded shells in German hands by then were a matter of frustration. The German engineers correctly identified the principle, a small radar transmitter in the shell, and reproduced the circuit on paper within weeks. What they could not reproduce was the miniature vacuum tube electronics rugged enough to survive a naval shell's launch acceleration. German wartime electronics depended on glass envelope tubes whose internal elements could withstand modest mechanical shock, but not 20,000 G. The American answer, pioneered at Sylvania and Crossley, used tube envelopes with shock-absorbing internal mountings, mica spacers, and welded internal connections rather than soldered joints, and was the product of an American consumer electronics industry that had been mass-producing rugged automobile radios for the decade before the war. The Reich's miniature electronics production base, by contrast, was small, war-strained, and incapable of the precision the proximity fuse required. The Germans had the schematic, they could not field the part. By the autumn of 1944, the proximity fuse had been released to American Army artillery. The first major ground use was at the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944. American artillery officers, equipped for the first time with shells that could detonate above an exposed target without a contact strike, doubled the lethality of every American medium and heavy artillery battery in the Ardennes. The German infantry assaults that came through the Schnee Eifel in the first days of the Bulge were broken in part by American 8-inch and 155mm rounds airbursting overhead. A wounded German prisoner taken at Bostonia told American interrogators that the explosions overhead were the worst thing he had ever experienced in 3 years of fighting. He did not know what kind of fuse the Americans were using. He was not the only one. The decisive use of the proximity fuse in the Pacific came against the Japanese kamikaze campaign at Okinawa in the spring of 1945. The kamikaze tactic, a Japanese pilot deliberately crashing his aircraft into an American ship, had begun in October 1944 and had grown through the winter into a coordinated mass attack doctrine. Off Okinawa between April and June of 1945, the Imperial Japanese Naval Air Service and Army Air Service launched approximately 1,500 kamikaze sorties at the American invasion fleet, hitting nearly 200 ships and sinking 36. The kamikaze loss rate would have been worse without the VT fuse. American 5-inch 38 caliber dual-purpose guns, firing VT-fused ammunition, accounted for the majority of kamikaze aircraft brought down before they could reach a target. The Navy's overall kill rate against kamikazes off Okinawa, using proximity fuse ammunition, ran at roughly 70%. Without the fuse, the same engagements would have produced a sustained hit rate around 25%. The arithmetic difference was somewhere between 100 and 150 additional American ships hit, with the casualties that implied. The British origin of the project deserves a careful note. In the summer of 1940, the British Admiralty's research arm had been working on a small radio Doppler fuse prototype based on pre-war work by WAS. Butemont and his team at the Air Defense Experimental Establishment. The prototype was promising, but the British wartime electronics industry was already saturated, producing radar sets and aircraft communications gear at the limit of capacity. In September 1940, the British government, through what came to be called the Tizard mission led by Sir Henry Tizard, brought a sealed black metal box across the Atlantic to Washington containing the most sensitive British scientific work of the war: radar, jet engine prototypes, atomic weapons research, and the early proximity fuse designs. The box was handed to American officials at a meeting at the National Academy of Sciences building. The proximity fuse work was handed to the U.S. Navy. The Navy handed it to the Carnegie Institution, which handed it to Merle Tuve. The American scaling effort that followed was not American science alone. It was a transatlantic project that began in a British laboratory and was finished in an American consumer electronics factory. The MIT Radiation Laboratory, which over the same period was developing the magnetron-based radar sets that would equip every Allied warship and bomber, shared engineering staff and knowledge with the Applied Physics Laboratory through the war. The two laboratories were the largest and second-largest scientific establishments in the United States during the war years. Between them, they employed more than 5,000 technical staff and accounted for a fraction of the wartime research budget that approached the Manhattan Project. The proximity fuse and the magnetron radar set were sister technologies, one in the shell, one in the ship's air search antenna. Together, they made American naval anti-aircraft defense, by 1944, an order of magnitude more lethal than it had been in 1941. The kamikaze defense of Okinawa was where the system worked at its peak. The Imperial Navy and Army flew approximately 1,500 kamikaze sorties against the American invasion fleet between April 1 and June 22, 1945. The standing combat air patrols of carrier fighters intercepted many of them before they reached the gun range of the picket destroyers. The picket destroyers, equipped with 5-inch 38 caliber dual-purpose mounts firing VT-fused ammunition, handled most of the rest. Approximately 350 kamikaze aircraft reached the main invasion fleet anchorage near Hagashi. The fleet's anti-aircraft batteries, again firing VT ammunition, brought most of them down at ranges between 2,000 and 5,000 yards. About 200 ships were nonetheless hit, 36 were sunk. Without the proximity fuse, every published Navy analysis of the operation agrees, the ship loss figures would have been roughly 3 times higher. 3 times higher would have meant approximately 110 American ships sunk off Okinawa rather than 36. The invasion would have continued. The cost would have been so much higher that the question of an early Japanese surrender, already pressing in Tokyo by July, might have been pushed by the Navy in directions different from those it actually took. The production effort behind the fuse was an American industrial story in its own right. By 1944, the Crossley Radio Corporation alone was running 3 shifts at 4 plants across the Midwest, employing roughly 20,000 workers, the great majority of them women, producing the miniature vacuum tubes and the assembled fuse noses. Sylvania Electric in Pennsylvania ran a parallel operation. The total American production of proximity fuses from 1942 through August 1945 was approximately 130 million units. The unit cost, which had begun at $732 per fuse in 1942, fell to $18 by 1945, a productivity gain on the order of 40 to 1 in 3 years. The proximity fuse was, by 1945, the most miniaturized mass-produced electronic device in the world, and the supply chain that produced it would seed the American consumer electronics, missile guidance, and computer industries of the 1950s and 1960s. The engineers who had learned to mount tube elements rigidly enough to survive a 5-inch shell's launch would go on to design the inertial guidance systems for the post-war Navy and Air Force missile programs. A small note from the deception program: the Allied gunners using VT-fused ammunition were told the shells contained a new mechanical clockwork fuse of unusual complexity. Defective shells were collected after exercises and returned to ordnance depots. Gun captains were instructed, by name and rank, not to discuss the new ammunition with friendly forces from other ships. The deception held. The first public mention of the proximity fuse in the American press came in September 1945, 6 weeks after the Japanese surrender. The Navy released a single photograph and a one-page summary. The full technical details of the fuse were not declassified until 1968. The men who designed the fuse did not become public figures. Merle Tuve returned to physics after the war and ran the Carnegie Institution's Department of Terrestrial Magnetism for 2 decades. The senior Crossley engineers went back to building radios. The Sylvania Tube engineers went into the consumer television industry that absorbed their accumulated wartime expertise. The Section T project itself was largely declassified in stages between 1946 and the late 1960s, with the most sensitive specifics held back until the Reagan administration. The Navy considered the proximity fuse, until the 1980s, second only to the atomic bomb in its impact on the Second World War. The Army considered it third, after the Garand rifle and the atomic bomb. The British, who had originated the idea before passing it to the Americans, considered it equal to radar in its impact on Allied air defense. The German engineers in occupied France, holding the recovered duds in late 1944, had been correct in their initial assessment that the design was a miniature radar. They had been correct in their suspicion that the tubes were the limiting factor. They had not been able to do anything about it. The American electronics industry was producing 40,000 of the impossible little tubes a day, and there was no German industrial base in 1944 capable of producing them at any rate that would have mattered. The shell came down. The Reich's engineers studied it. The war ended with the Germans no closer to a working German equivalent than they had been in the spring of 1944. The fuse remained the closed problem the Reich had identified and could not solve. There's a quiet line in the post-war U.S. Naval Bureau of Ordnance summary of the fuse program that catches a reader who looks at it. The Bureau wrote that the proximity fuse had been the most thoroughly classified American weapon of the war for the simple reason that no one knew in 1942 whether the Japanese or the Germans might independently develop one. The Navy spent the first 2 years of the fuse operational life assuming the enemy might field its own version any day. The enemy never did. The Americans had built, by 1944, the technical and industrial base that produced 130 million miniaturized radar transmitters at a manufacturing tolerance the Reich's electronics industry was years away from achieving. The shell that the Germans cut open in 1944 had not arrived from a competitor. It had arrived from a generation ahead.